y'all. Welcome back, day 2 of our New Testament journey. Today we're going to talk about the four gospel writers and who they're writing for and why they're writing for who they're writing for. And I just want to make one clarification from yesterday. I jumped the gun a little bit. I wanted to talk about the differences between the gospels today. Yesterday, I really just wanted to emphasize that they all are trying to get across that one message, that this guy, Jesus Christ, really existed and really did these things. Now, some biblical scholars today, they're actually scholars who try to disprove the things that happen in the Bible as being real. And so they say because there's 4 different accounts where Jesus says 4 different things, that means that they can't be true, right? Now, that's pretty easily disproved if you think, okay, if I picked 4 of you guys out of the class to tell me, what did Mr. Flores talk about the day before? We would get 4 different answers. You would have a similar theme, but there would be 4 different things that I said. I might not have said the exact same thing in each different account. And so the same is true for the gospel writers, right? These are 4 different guys writing for 4 different audiences, pretty much 4 different audiences, and they've got a specific focus in each one for that audience. And so in some things, Jesus is going to emphasize certain things, and in others, he might de-emphasize things based upon who the gospel is being written for and when it was written. So we'll start with St. Matthew, apostle called by Jesus Christ, was a tax collector. And Matthew's audience is going to be the Christians who were once Jewish, or you could say Jewish Christians. And his main focus is on how Christ fulfills the prophecies and promises of the Old Testament. And so that's what he's going to focus on. That's what he's going to emphasize in his gospel. And so if you ask, why isn't he talking about this? Or why is he going on so long about that? Well, it's because his mission is to show how Christ fulfills the promises of the Old Testament. He's not so much worried about people who are unfamiliar with the Old Testament, right? He's going to assume his audience is familiar with the Old Testament. And so that's why Matthew's gospel is going to look a little bit different than, let's say, Mark and Luke's gospel. Speaking of Mark, Mark's gospel is written for the Gentiles in Rome. So it's said that Mark followed St. Peter to Rome, and that he is writing for the Gentiles, just meaning non-Jewish people, in Rome. And Mark's is the shortest gospel. Because think, right, if these guys have no understanding of the Old Testament, they don't know who Abraham and Isaac and Jacob are, what does Mark need to do? He needs to tell them, this guy Jesus existed. This guy Jesus really did all these miracles. This guy Jesus died, and this guy Jesus rose from the dead. You should believe in this guy. He's pretty awesome, right? That's Mark's mission. So it's the shortest gospel, and he focuses on what Jesus did rather than all of these references back to the Old Testament. So again, you start to see some of the differences between the two. Now Luke, what makes Luke's gospel unique is that he had a connection with Mary. Maybe he actually talked to Mary, knew someone who knew Mary. But Luke is traveling with the Apostle Paul, and the Apostle Paul is known as the Apostle. And so Paul is going out into the world to share the good news, and Luke is going with him. And so Luke's gospel is also Christians who had been Gentiles, right? So you could say that evangelizing to the Gentiles. So his gospel is also going to differ a lot from Matthew's in that sense. But Luke is also a literary master. Okay, not knocking Mark. Okay, I don't think anyone in our class is named Mark, if I can remember. But Luke is well educated and a literary master. If you read Luke's gospel, you see what I'm talking about versus the terse kind of nature of Mark's gospel, right? And Luke is making all these other connections for the Gentiles to come to know who Jesus is. Now, what about John? We haven't talked at all about John. We've talked about Matthew, Mark, and Luke and how similar they are with a few subtle differences. John's gospel is very, very different. Every one of the other gospels kind of follows the same timeline with a few exceptions. But it's written in the same kind of style. It's kind of, chronological, really, from the get-go. John's begins with, in the beginning, the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And it's a whole different style of writing, very much this literary, symbolic language, and very, very, very different than the other 3. So he's not included in the Synoptic Gospels. What is John doing here? Well, he's writing for Jewish Christians, right? So the same idea of people that are familiar with the Old Testament. So right from the get-go, you should see in John's Gospel a connection to Genesis. Uh, John is saying right from the beginning, if you want to know who Jesus Christ is, he is that word that was talked about in the book of Genesis, right? When God created the world through the power of his word, that is Jesus Christ, second person of the Trinity, the incarnate Son of God. That's the guy. It's not that these three don't mention that Jesus is the Son of God. They all do. But John comes right out the gate and says, Jesus Christ is divine. He is God himself. He is the Word made flesh. Now, why is this important? Well, okay, so we believe that this is the John from the Apostles, John, right? And so maybe he wrote the gospel early on, but we think he wrote it later in life, like when he was at an advanced age. So you'll probably usually see John depicted as old when he's writing the gospel, but young when he's with Jesus. And he's the apostle that Jesus loved. And the idea is that he's got this firsthand account, but that he also is really, really, really focused on the signs that Jesus does to show that he is in fact God, right? That he is the incarnate, the Word made flesh. And so in John's Gospel, we get a lot more of this symbolic language. Now, that doesn't mean that the things didn't happen. Rather, John is using specific terms, or you could say a specific style to really, really, really emphasize not so much like on this day Jesus did this, and on this day Jesus did this, and on this day Jesus did that. When we say it's not a historical narrative in that sense. Um, what John is focused on is you seeing the way that God sees, right? That reading John's gospel, your vision is transformed into God's vision. Now, that itself is a symbolic kind of understanding of it. Uh, what John is emphasizing throughout all of his gospels with all the miracles that he's going to emphasize, or the signs, the wonders, is that by the time you get to the crucifixion and the resurrection, when you put down John's gospel, you know that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. That's his mission. And it's a very different read than the other three. There's not the same one is better than the other, but if you ask most people, like, what's your favorite gospel, they'll probably say John, because the other ones can, like, especially like Mark, you can read Mark in one sitting. They kind of go, here's what happened, here's what Jesus did, here's what Jesus said. John's gospel is very different. So we've kind of taken a look at the four different gospel writers, the four different gospels, who they were written for, why they were written. Tomorrow, what we're going to be doing then is saying, okay, these events happened, the gospels are written, what comes next? And what you're going to see is that the story continues in the Acts of the Apostles. And that's what we'll turn to tomorrow. Okay, guys, so make sure you finish the assignment for today, and I will see you in the next one.